Welcome to 99 zu 1. We at 99 zu 1, together with Michael Kuhn, have worked quite intensively in the last months to create a series that basically elaborates a critique on post-colonial thinking, post-colonial theory. And in this episode, what we want to do is try to summarize and condense all these critiques into a very short overview or summary video that allows a person that is new to this critique to get an overview what this critique is about. If it's obvious that in such a summary, it's not possible to elaborate all the arguments and all the quotations and citations that are needed in order to prove that the critique holds. If you want to do that, you are, of course, free to go into the episodes that are dealing with this critique in detail. In this episode here, we are just going to give an outline and some initial arguments to maybe also create some interest to go deeper into the series itself, and also serve as a tool to maybe instigate some debate. And that is something that we are looking for in the future, to be able to debate this critique and these points that are being discussed here today. Without further ado, let's get into the gist of it and bring Michael Kuhn in. Herzlich willkommen. Welcome back to 99 zu 1, Michael.
Yes, hello. Hi, Nadim.
Nice to have you here again. Michael, why don't you give us an overview over your critique of post-colonial theory, post-colonialism, decolonized thinking, however you want to call it.
Yes, I'm trying to do this. Just a technical thing. I don't know, something is wrong with my computer. So I want to read what I wanted to say from the text that I wrote, and please accept my apologies. I want to do this because what I wrote is anyway so comprised, and also I want to make sure by reading it that I do not start to talk about this and that and here and there, and then somehow takes too much time. So please accept that I'm going to read what I want to say, and the paper we will also make this available for you somewhere. Nadim will do this.
Yes.
Okay. So two remarks. My paper is called Key Points of My Critique About Post-Colonial Thinking, or alternatively, How the Primal Logic of Capitalist Thinking Takes Hold of the Thinkers of the World, also in post-colonial thinking. This is a provocation, but my whole paper is a provocation. That is one thing I wanted to say. So these are very short hypotheses, 10 altogether, in which I outline my main points of critique. And if you listen carefully to what I'm saying, at one point, one of my critique of post-colonial thinking is that it makes itself immune against critique, and I stick to this point. This is, in fact, what I have to critically say about post-colonial thinking. I nevertheless, though it is true that post-colonial thinking is immune against critique, I just try it, and I try to persuade people who share this view of post-colonial thinking, nevertheless, listen to what I say, and maybe they change their mind. At least we could maybe come into a discussion with these people, and that is a major intention of my presentation, to discuss this with these people who somehow share this post-colonial thinking, because that is the thinking, in fact, that is spread around the world, especially among the critical thinkers. So let me start with my paper. As I said, basically, I will read my main points, and just to be as short as possible. Now, my short introduction is this. Once the colonized world has been bombed via the Vietnam War towards capitalism, and secondly, due to the abolishment of an anti-capitalist society system, the Soviet Union, the world since around the 90s is consisting of countries all over the world, all ruled by the rationale of capitalism. And since then, the primal logic of capitalistic thinking takes hold of the thinkers of the world, including the critical thinking coined post-colonial thinking. And the capitalist logic of thinking, which I'm referring to here now, is thinking in terms of the demarcation of the political entities, the nation states of which capitalism across the world, across the world consists of nation states ruled by the rationale of capitalism. And thanks to this is my provocative point, critical thinking, coined post-colonial thinking, also is caught by the logic of national identities, of the articulation, of the representation of these political bodies of nation states. Post-colonial thinking, that's my point number one. Post-colonial thinking is a critique of what it coins via political entities such as European, or more recently as Northern or Southern sciences. Post-colonial thinking departs from a critique of the theories of the European social sciences, a critique which, with its notion of centered, does not critique what these theories say about Europe, but which attributes these theories explicitly to be valid theories about the European societies. It is a critique that is fine with these theories as long as these European theories remain centered on the Europeans, but not about the societies beyond Europe. All societies, that is the message of the critique of a Eurocentrism, need above all their own theories, centered all on themselves. Again, the critique says the theories of the European social sciences are fine as long as they remain in Europe. If they travel beyond Europe, that is what we don't like, because all the countries around the world need their own theories, all centers on themselves. I have to say here a few words about the European disciplinary social sciences, because I want to say briefly what it means if you argue that the social sciences, the European social sciences, are okay as long as they stay where they originate from. Let me say a few words about this, these European disciplinary social sciences. Just a little comment. European, of course, stands for these social sciences, for this way of thinking, disciplinary social sciences, which occurred in the history of Europe. And of course, if you talk about the European disciplinary social sciences, you talk, in other words, about the social sciences carried out in what you could also say in the West, or if you want, in the world of in the capitalist world. Now, something about the European social sciences. The European disciplinary social sciences and their theories are affirmative theories created via disciplinary thought. That is a statement I have to prove, but I just want to say this briefly in this context. Disciplinary thought is a construct of thought, which in this construct of its disciplinarity implies that the citizen societies, their economy, and their political body, the nation state, that capitalism is the naturalized nature of any society. That is what constitutes the disciplinarity of thought. How this is the case and why this is the case, I have to prove. I just want to say already the construct of the disciplinarity is a construction that is affirmative, affirming capitalism, saying that capitalist societies are the nature of any society. More than that, the categories founding thinking in these individual disciplines, thoughts are affirmative found in these disciplinary thoughts, the categories founding thinking in these individual disciplinary thoughts are affirmative foundations of disciplinary thinking, taking the nature of capitalist societies as the nature of any society. And they do this in any of their disciplines. Just quickly, two examples. In sociology, the dualism founding sociological thinking, the dualism of individual and society, is the naturalization of the nature of the hostile social relations in citizen societies. Because, briefly, individual and society means individual versus society, and sociological thinking founds its thinking on these tensions between individual and society. And my point is that this tension of individual society is the way these capitalist societies, these citizen societies are constructed, but sociological thinking takes this as the nature of any society. My second example, briefly, is economy. Economy, as you all know, starts with the concept of scarcity. Scarcity is what is the point of departure of economic thinking. It founds economic thinking, and from this concept of scarcity, the whole theory of economic thinking is somehow developed and elaborated. And this is, again, an affirmative construct which presents the rationale of a never completed growth of abstract wealth as the nature of any economy. You can easily notice that this notion of scarcity, there is always too little, is a translation of what characterizes capitalism, the never completed growth of abstract wealth, that is wealth measured in money. So, in short, both already the construct of disciplinarity as also the individual disciplines, I gave examples about sociology and economy, theories which are considering the nature of capitalist society as the nature of any society, and in this respect are fundamentally affirmative theories. Back to Eurocentrism, back to post-colonial thinking. The critique coined Eurocentrism, a notion created by Edward Said, the most prominent and widely accepted critique of post-colonial thinking, critiques something else than the affirmative contents of these theories, affirming capitalism, as I said just before, with my few comments about disciplinarity. With its notion Eurocentric, these critiques rejects this knowledge as a knowledge that does not allow to understand societies beyond Europe or beyond, better, more updated, beyond the North. By saying this, again, one should notice this critique firstly recognizes that this European disciplinary affirmative knowledge is very appropriate knowledge. It does not critique this knowledge, but explicitly recognizes this knowledge as valid knowledge, as long as it stays in Europe. And this, since these theories are theories about capitalism, affirming capitalism, the critique of Eurocentrism confirms these affirmative theories about capitalism. And this is my question, and assumes that the global south is not capitalism. Is it really not? Or does this critique of Eurocentrism only want to say that there are variations of capitalism and insists only on this, that their societies are variations of capitalism? Yes, indeed, these countries, as I said at the beginning, of the global south are the losers of the worldwide rivalries among capitalist countries. But therefore, they are no capitalist countries. Is it this what the critique of theories centered on Europe wants to say? That they are variations of capitalism? Not really. The critique of a theory centered on a political entity, on Europe, wants to argue about something else. This critique only wants to insist on the particularity of these countries, whatever the nature of their societies is. It wants to insist on their national identities, on theories centered on themselves. That was my first point. Now, this was what I wanted to say about what the critique of Eurocentrism really wants to say. It wants to say that there must be theories others than the European theories which are centered about the world beyond Europe, and they should not apply these theories from Europe, but they don't criticize these theories as affirming the capitalism of Europe. They don't care about this. That is not their point. My second point. Indeed, if you then look at theories, at the indigenized theories, the non-European centered theories, created by post-colonial thinking about their non-European societies, indeed they create thought centered on the countries of the global south, which ironically create nothing but variations of the European disciplinary social sciences. And by creating these variations of disciplinary theories, post-colonial thinking is, and this is another historical irony, post-colonial thinking is the universalization of these European disciplinary social sciences across the global south, and thus also the universalization of their affirmatism of capitalism being the nature of any social life. That is my second point. If you look at the indigenized theories, you will find that they are only nothing else but variations of disciplinary thinking. To give you just an example, as I said before, related to sociology, sociology is founded on this dualism, ambiguity, or whatever you call it, called individual and society. That's where sociological thinking starts. An indigenized, non-Eurocentered, non-Eurocentric theory is discussed in many variations across the world. Just to give you ones from an Arab social scientist, El-Jabbar he's called, and he discusses in an article that he published about an alternative sociology. He discusses there the concept of what is called the dualism of balance and conflict. And very briefly, if you think about the difference between individual and society on one hand and balance and conflict on the other hand, it is not so difficult to find out that the alternative balance and conflict is only a variation of individual society. What is the variation? The variation is that balance and conflict shows the relation between individual and society in their process. Once individual and society are in a good balance, once they are in a conflict. And the idea here is that sociology, indigenized sociology, must look at this process between balance and conflict between individual and society. In other words, just an example, indigenized, non-Eurocentric sociology is a variation of the disciplinary thinking of the social sciences. And this is no surprise, because in fact, if you don't criticize the disciplinary social sciences, you are inevitably trapped by the way of thinking on which this disciplinary thinking is founded. And what you do is you create variations of the same. And thanks to these variations you create, you universalize fundamentally this very European disciplinary thinking. You are the one with your post-colonial theory who spreads this very way of thinking you critique as Eurocentered by creating these variations over the whole world. That means especially, of course, over the world of the former colonized countries. That's my second point. The universalization of disciplinary thinking of the European social sciences via creating variations of the same disciplinary. And this happens, I just said this about sociology, but this happens across all the individual disciplinary social sciences. But of course, this is something that needs to be proved. I cannot do that here. My third point is, post-colonial thinking is nationalistic thinking. That means that it is thinking which is not critiquing the nation state of the southern countries in their political and economic rationales, aiming at the competition battle about economic and political power among the nation states in the world of nation states, a battle for which they use their societies. Post-colonial thinking is concerned. Post-colonial thinking is not critiquing that, but is concerned with the political identity of the citizens of these societies, that is concerned with their identification with their citizen societies, with their nation state, and with their political and economic rationales imposed on these people by their nation states. It is thinking that struggles in a world all following the same rationality of capitalism with the creation of demarcations due to the identical society system. It struggles with the demarcations of their national societies from others. It struggles with a nationalism of society that is with the identity, that means with the identification of citizens with their nation states, and their struggle with the problem creating such national identities for nation states which cannot offer their citizens the conceded materialism as the imperialistic nation states do with their citizens, because this wealth you need for this offer identify yourself with your nation state. It does only good services for you, as what you can see from your participation in the wealth that these societies create. This is not an option for these societies, and that's why the post-colonial thinking, creating theories concerned with the national identity problem of these societies, are struggling with a particular challenge, creating these kind of national identities. Their nationalism, therefore, is constructed in categorical spheres beyond the material interests of the southern citizens, that is, in the sphere, therefore, of aesthetics, culture, and even in the very colonial concept of races. Just an example, I can very much recommend a book published by a colleague from Cameroon, Léon-Marie Nyodo is called. And you will see in this book that this book even departs when discussing the question of an African identity. It starts from discussing the discussion about aesthetics, about painting, about cultures in Africa, and derives from there the challenges for creating an African identity. To give you an example from the post-colonial scientific discussion about this, probably one of the most known concept of creating a national identities beyond this conceded materialism, positioned in the world of culture, that means beyond any material interest of the people, is the notion of a strategic essentialism, and that is a notion that comes from Spivak, who is certainly one of the most prominent theorists in post-colonial thinking. What is this about? Also, I can only be very brief. I will elaborate on that in my 4 or 5 videos we are producing parallelly. Strategic essentialism means this. Essentialism is a critique of the concept of culture, which wants to say that the problem of culture is its essentialism, and that means the problem of culture is that this concept is in twofold ways problematic, and this is what one has to think about, and that is that this concept of culture is firstly demarcating people from each other via their culture, and it's secondly not flexible. So there is no progress in this culture. If you have an essentialist concept of culture, there is no development in these societies. The point Spivak is mainly talking about when she talks about the strategic essentialism is that she knows very well that culture has this notion of demarcations, the hostility implied in this concept of culture. And since she is reflecting about the position, the identity of the citizens of these southern societies, she struggles with the implication of this concept of culture. And what she struggles with is to say, yes, culture is a concept for demarcating national societies from each other, but we should be careful with using this essential as an essentialist concept, because then it has that problem of demarcation and hostility, and also of no progress within these societies. Then she argues, and that's why it's called strategic essentialism. She says, however, yes, that is the case. Culture has these implications. It is demarcating and hostile. It creates hostilities between cultures. But given the need to create national identities for a strategic reason, and for this very strategic reason, to create national identities, she even says, therefore, you have to give up your critique about culture and stick to the essentialism, which I basically otherwise find very problematic. So that is what she calls the strategic essentialism, committing yourself to a culture, disregarding the demarcation and the lacking flexibility, or yes, let's call it flexibility in this concept. So that is what she calls strategic essentialism. And you can see from this kind of discussion that I just tried to rephrase a little bit, you can see from this discussion what this debate is about. In fact, it is about the concept or the creation of national identities and creation of national identities beyond, it discusses these identities as a concern which is entirely beyond the material living interests of people. However, one should be careful. The fact that this is the case, that the identity they are discussing here about is beyond the material living interests of people, doesn't mean that these people like Spivak are nationalists. They are just struggling with the creation of a nationalism that can only be positioned in a sphere that is beyond the material living interests of the people, because this sphere of the material living interests of people does not provide any approach, any arguments towards the identification with their society bodies, with their nation states, etc. So that's my second point. No, that was my third point. Post-colonial thinking is nationalistic thinking by its nature. My fourth point is post-colonial thinking is even anti-critical thinking that critiques theories critiquing capitalism. It argues against the critique of capitalism practiced by the countries of the global south, that this critique does not care about the concerns of the subaltern nation states and their position in the world of nation states. In other words, that the critique of capitalism is not caring about the particularities of these subalterns. That is, that critique of capitalism is not good because it's not nationalistic thinking. So again, not only, as I tried to show about the critique of Eurocentrism recognizes and confirms the affirmatism of disciplinary thinking, affirming the nature of capitalist society as the nature of any society. It even critiques a critique of capitalism. It is anti-critical thinking by arguing that the critique of capitalism does not allow to think about national identities of the citizens. That means of the identification of the people with their nation state. If you look at the critique of Marx, post-colonial thinking is in fact doing, then you will notice that the critiques of Marx is that his critique of capitalism is a critique that generalizes view on these societies as being capitalist societies across all the societies, because what Marx is saying is they're all capitalist societies. And the critique of post-colonial thinking about Marx, and this critique is too general. It doesn't allow, similar to what they say about what Eurocentrism means, it does not allow to reflect on the particularities of the southern individual nationalities. So, in other words, also Marx is Eurocentric, Marxism is Eurocentric thinking, and when you go into the details, you will find that they prove this statement that Marx is Eurocentric by digging out in his theory all kinds of theories which in fact say something general about capitalism. And what they try to prove then is that this is not really matching with the particularities of these countries. So, in short, post-colonial thinking is anti-critical thinking in the sense that it critiques the critique of capitalism. My fifth point number 5, yes. Post-colonial thinking accomplishes the determinism of the historical materialism with its epistemological concept of thinking through space. Mamma mia, piano man. It accomplishes the determinism of the histomat with its epistemological concept of thinking through place. That is the thinking through place, that is the creature of the famous Satie. By conceptualizing place to the resource of thought, thus making thought the voicing of what humans are told by the reality, it expropriates humans from the power of human minds. It expropriates humans from what distinguishes them from animals and denies man his power of judgment and thus his basis for decision-making. As briefly, it was the historical materialism who argued that thought is the result of the reality. There is this famous saying, the reality makes thought. And this is, in fact, a determinism which is arguing that thought people create is just a reflection of the reality, which means they are given the thought by the reality. Marx meant this as a critique of thought, but in the historical materialism, the interpretation of Marx's critique, this was considered as the nature of thinking. And this determinism is further developed by post-colonial thinking by saying that it must be thought about anything must be the product of the place where the thinkers think. In other words, it is thinking is voicing what the reality tells you, and by saying that thinking, thought is what the reality tells you, of course, then logically any thought about the reality must be the same if the reality is the same, and this is a determinism combined with an affirmatism that cannot be more radical. And it has the implications I don't want to repeat. That was my point number 5. My point number 6 is this. Post-colonial thinking is thinking that is hostile to thinking. How is that possible? Again, with this very epistemological concept of thinking through place, post-colonial thinking propagates a methodological affirmatism in which thinking is denied to question any social objectives and must become the mere loudspeaker of the executed social objectives of national identities. The notion of Eurocentrism is exactly such a phrase in which, in fact, it is said that what people say is the product of the political identity about which they talk. So the idea behind Eurocentrism is that European ideas, European theories are products, creatures of the European societies. Similar, accordingly, there is that quite well-known book by Rowan Connell, and she, in fact, gives her theories the attribute of Southern theories, which means theories are made by the place where you think. And in that sense, thinking, post-colonial thinking, is hostile to thinking because it presents thinking as something that is only voicing what the reality tells you. And in that sense, it is affirmative to the existing social objectives executed in the existing reality. So again, post-colonial thinking is thinking hostile to thinking. Point number 7, post-colonial thinking immunizes thinking against critique. Yes, the radicalization of the relativism of disciplinary thinking of the European social sciences, everybody knows that. Social thought is relatively objective social thought according to the epistemologies of the disciplinary social sciences, dependent on the approach that you use. That is what European social sciences insist on about thought. It is objective thought, but it is only relative objective thought. This relativism, relative, but it's objective, but relatively objective, dependent on the approach that you choose and dependent, of course, on the discipline through which you are thinking. This is radicalized by post-colonial thinking via dissolving thought finally into nothing else but articulations of a multiplicity of subjective views, all representing the views of politically constructed social entities. As Chakrabarty argues, what you think about elections, for example, depends very much if you are in India or if you are in Australia. So what he is saying is that what you think about the world depends on the location where you are, which means, in other words, that thinking is the product of the political entities in which you are, and that means it is entirely subjective thinking in the sense that thinking only represents the subjective views of where you are. So that thought is representing the views of politically constructed social entities, and thus it immunizes thought against any critique and makes any discourse about knowledge towards debates about the undebatable. Yes, in fact, if social thought is the product of the location where you are, then any social thought is relative thought dependent on the location where you are. It is necessarily absolutely subjective thought, and if it's absolutely subjective thought, it is impossible to argue about subjective thought. The only way you can argue about is to say, my thought is this and your thought is this, but there is no way of arguing, exchanging thought in another way, but saying, this is mine, this is yours. In other words, social post-colonial thinking is thinking that does not allow any discourse anymore. It is a thinking that is immune against critique and doesn't allow any exchange between your views, any critique anymore. Number 8, post-colonial thinking is reactionary thinking. Now, this is a bit a dramatic way of phrasing this word of reactionary, but I stick to that at least in the context of writing such a paper with such kind of statements. Yes, it is reactionary thinking. Why is that? It reintroduces, post-colonial thinking reintroduces irrationalisms such as religion and race, that is, mindsets from pre-capitalistic societies. And it even reintroduces categories from colonialism. Race. It reintroduces categories that put thinking behind the status of emancipation from religion, as the European social sciences did. And by doing this, it conceptualizes humans as powerless victims of their fate, citizens which must bow to the executed social objectives in the social reality as those of a kind of divine power. In this sense, post-colonial thinking is really, and I stick to that, reactionary thinking. And it is remarkable, in fact, that it even somehow gives categories the disciplinary social sciences have already criticized, categories created during and for colonialism, that it even creates these categories, especially the category of race, as a positive category allowing to create this national, solving this identity problem of the citizens of these new nation state ruled societies. My almost last point, number 9, post-colonial thinking is a critique. Yes, it is a critique of the world of nation states from the perspective of the power battles of the political powers about their power positions in a world of nation states, applied to the sphere of science. I want to refer here as an example to Farid Alatas, who, among others, that is a notion that, of course, not only he is somehow using, that is the notion of scientific hegemony, that is somehow applied to the whole post-colonial discourse. And the notion of scientific hegemony is quite revealing, because if you look how, for example, Farid is arguing in his papers where he talks about scientific hegemony, it is somehow quite remarkable to notice that in one of his articles, he is discussing the question if the superiority of the Japanese economy as a successful imperialist economy managing to sell their products all over the world, and by doing this being a major imperialistic economic player in the world, that in his article I'm referring to here, where he talks about scientific hegemony, this guy is seriously raising the question, if the fact that the Japanese economy is a successful leading imperialist economy, if this would be also means to shift the Japanese social sciences with the help of the economic power of Japan towards the status of being also a science which has another position in the science world than it has. He denies that question, but only the fact that somebody really raises the question shows how science is seen in this post-colonial debate. It is seen as a means to carry out in the sphere of science the battles about the status of the nation states regarding the political power and the economic power positions they have in a world of nation states. That was my point number 9. I come to my last point. My last point, number 10, is this. Post-colonial thinking provides, with its reintroduction of all kinds of irrationalisms, and with their national identities, ideologies, for the political demarcations of the nationally constructed citizen societies. It creates ideologies for the rivalries and hostilities among national societies and among their nation states, all fighting about the political and economic power in the world, consisting of the essentially same nation states with the essentially same capitalist rationales, encountering each other as a challenge for their national rationales, encounters for which they all instrumentalize their people, including for their encounters in wars. This is not funny at all, but I stick to this point. This might not be the purpose of any post-colonial thinker, but it is an implication of the reintroduction of all kinds of irrationalism, such as culture, such as in particular race, ethnicities, nationalisms anyway. It is the case that these are all ideologies which provide the nation states' policies with the ideologies for the demarcation of the national societies from each other, wherever they need them in their rivalries, in their hostilities, and finally also in their wars among each other, fighting against the political and economic power they have in the world of nation states. This is what post-colonial thinking finally does, providing ideologies for the hostilities between the national societies on the world. And with this statement that I, of course, also would have to prove along the theories, I want to finish my 10 points articulating my critique. And if I let me just finish with repeating my headline, because after saying what I said via these 10 points, it might be better understandable why I phrased my alternative headline like this: how the primal logic of capitalist thinking takes hold of the thinkers of the world, also in post-colonial thinking, saying that after the world has become a world of nation states, all ruled by the same capitalist rationale, the very capitalist way of thinking, considering everybody and everything as a competitor about capitalist wealth and about the political power of nation states, the fundamental logic behind post-colonial thinking is exactly this. How can I contribute with my thinking to the status of the society I'm presenting, or more generally, the societies of the global South? This is what thinking, post-colonial thinking, is driven by. This logic of capitalist thinking, the competitive thinking about capitalism is all about. That's all. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this outline. listeners have any further interest, please go and check the whole series that we are currently producing in English and has already been produced in German. And should there be any interest of debating any of the points that Michael introduced today, please feel free to contact us at any time. We will make it happen because we are very eager to discuss exactly these points and this critique. So thanks again, Michael, for your summary.
Yeah, that's why, let me just add here quickly. That's why I said in the beginning, my point was, as I said, post-colonial thinking somehow immunizes itself against critique. But nevertheless, I phrase my critique, and the hope is that this will invite people to consider these critical points. And they are very provocative, but they must be provocative, because if you want to provoke a discussion, you have to be provocative.
Okay, thank you, Michael. See you for the next episode that delves deeper into these topics. Bye-bye, Michael.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht, das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.